Welcome to this conversation of the Georgetown Literary Festival 2021, Microcosmos. Today, in this conversation, The Shifting Shores of Language, I am pleased to welcome the distinguished writer from Japan, Minae Mizumura. Minae Mizumura is an internationally renowned novelist and critic based in Tokyo. She has published 4 books of fiction, 3 books of non-fiction, and co-authored a compilation of epistolary essays. She is acclaimed for her audacious experimentation and skillful storytelling. Her work pays homage to the Japanese literary tradition while breaking new ground. 4 of her books, all of which have won major awards, including the Yomiuri Literature Award, have been translated into English by Juliet Winters Carpenter in close collaboration with the author. Please welcome Minae Mizumura. Hello, Minae. Thank you so much for being with us at the Georgetown Literary Festival.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'd like to start by asking you about your growing up, your childhood. You were born in Japan, and you spent your childhood there, but then you moved to the United States, Long Island, New York, at the age of 12. And you remained there for about 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. I'd like to know if you could tell us about what it was like growing up in 2 vastly different countries, and particularly how did that affect you as a writer later on, particularly speaking, listening, and reading, and then writing also in 2 different languages.
Okay, sure. Well, when my parents told me that we would all be moving to New York because of my father's job, and would be staying there for some time, I was simply happy, elated. I bragged about it to my friends, who all looked incredulous. You see, for many Japanese, and I suppose for many others in the rest of the world, the United States at that time, this was in early 60s, seemed like a magical land, a land that was filled with all that was wonderful, like Disneyland, rich, colorful, and unscarred by the war. But then that happy feeling gradually vanished as I began my life in the States. Not being able to understand the language everyone spoke around me was a miserable experience, especially because I was just entering my adolescence, when being accepted by one's peers becomes supremely important. I did not dislike the United States. Life was more comfortable. We lived in a house twice the size of a house in Tokyo. We had a car. We had a huge refrigerators, one in the kitchen and another one in the basement. I think it's like your refrigerator. People were kind, but I just felt miserable, too miserable even to try even to master English. I escaped from my new environment by immersing myself in reading an old collection of modern Japanese literature my parents brought with them. For various reasons, I ended up staying in the United States for the next 20 years, as I said, going to college and then even to graduate school. I always spoke Japanese at home. I was married early to a Japanese. And as a consequence, my spoken English remains to this day far from being fluent. But 20 years is a long time, and my reading and writing ability gradually and necessarily improved. I know I now find myself reading perhaps more English than Japanese, and that must inform my Japanese writing in one way or another. My editor tells me that my writing has a distinctive voice, my signature voice, but I don't know if that's true or he's just trying to make me feel good, as editors often do.
I'd like to touch a bit about your novels, particularly your first novel. What I find interesting about your work is that your writing is decidedly contemporary, and yet you have a strong connection to the past. I think particularly with the early modernist Japanese writers, that's what I can see in your writing. In fact, your first novel, Light and Darkness Continued, was a continuation of Natsume Soseki's unfinished final novel. And also your third novel, A True Novel, was a retelling of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favorite novels.
Good.
Yes, but I find that
I'm happy
aspect
to
of
know
your
that.
work. Yes. Also, I love Soseki. He is also one of my
Okay,
favorite
really?
Japanese
Wow.
writers. Yes, and I've only, of course, read him in translation, but I really love his work.
Oh, good.
But I find that very fascinating that you had this kind of conversation with writers like Soseki and also Emily Bronte, and I'm wondering, is that how you started writing? Was it a kind of perhaps a way to pay tribute, perhaps, to some of the writers who you admired?
Yeah, I think definitely it was a tribute. But my works are not only a tribute to literary works of the past. I think I was trying through my works to remind the readers that writing is not a matter of self-expression. You see, reading begets writing. So it's by reading the great works of the past that one can begin to aspire to become a meaningful writer, a writer that keeps enriching one's literary heritage, as well as the entire literary heritage we humans have created together. And I believe this message has become especially important today when the writings by those who have hardly read anything are flooding our everyday life. So I'm sure many of our audience have read Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I was a great fan of hers too. But I doubt if there. I didn't know that you've not the missile thing. And I don't know about the conditions, literary situations in Malaysia, but I doubt if many of you have heard of Natsume Soseki or let alone read uh, his last work, Light and Dark. So I appreciate your bringing his name up. Soseki, as you know, is considered the greatest writer modern Japan has produced, and Light and Dark, or Light and Darkness, one of his greatest works, if not the greatest. Soseki is still read, but not as much as before, and I wanted Japanese people to go back to him once again and to say to themselves how lucky we were to have had someone like him at the dawn of our modern literature.
Absolutely. Was that something that was shocking or surprising to to the Japanese literary landscape, when to have someone, a young emerging writer, with a new voice, who is boldly taking this decision to continue and finish off the last unfinished novel of a great master? Was that something? How was it received in Japan? Was it seen as a kind of bold and maybe even brazen act?
Yeah, um, I think so. I mean, many people criticized me, and I even heard of a high school teacher. I mean, there are so many things that came, but this is particularly sort of left an impression on me. I heard of a high school teacher who was so enraged at what I did that, when he started talking about my work, his face turned red and he just lost his words. But there was no internet at those times, and so you couldn't really have the kind of mass hysteria that you have now. And luckily, those once enraged people, are now dead. May their soul rest in peace, as they say in English. So
Yes.
I guess time is a panacea for everything. It works to it doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves most of the problems.
Yes,
And
I agree with
and
that.
and one of the reasons why I chose to write um, the continuation of Soseki is that it finished the novel. Light and Dark is a work that most resembles a detective story. It has a strong plot. It's a plot-driven novel, and it was about to reach its climactic point, a point where the truth was about to be revealed when Soseki suddenly died. So he had a stomach ulcer and suffered an overbleeding. Um, I felt terribly frustrated not knowing the end. And others must have felt the same because many readers, including novelists, critics, and scholars, made numerous conjectures as to how the story would have ended. So I said to myself, why not finish the novel myself? I had always admired Soseki, obviously, and read his work so many times that it seemed easy enough to replicate his rather idiosyncratic style. And besides, it was the first and the only Soseki novel where a female protagonist appears alongside that of a male protagonist.
Mm.
And it's written in such a way that the reader's sympathy lies more with her than with him. So it seemed as if the novel was inviting me, a woman writer, to finish it.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Okay.
The other thing I noticed about your work is that most, if not all, of your novels have been first published in the form of serialization in Japanese newspapers.
Mhm.
And I know that that was a way in which many of the early modernist writers like Soseki or Tanizaki and Kawabata even, I think many of them used to publish their novels in that form. Is that still a tradition that is very strong in Japan today, or was your decision to publish as a serialization a conscious decision to bring that tradition to life?
Well, I like working with the serialization format, and I'm very aware of the indigenous nature, or not indigenous, but I'm thankful that it has continued. But I couldn't call it a conscious choice of my part because that's how many writers still write in Japan. We writers serialize in weekly magazines, monthly literary journals, and newspapers. And the serialization provides writers with a steady income, which is just what writers usually need.
Yes.
Naturally, serialization has its drawbacks, especially if you're writing fiction. First, you need to have a pretty good idea of how your story is going to end before you start. Tanizaki, as you mentioned, sometimes started without thinking ahead and ended up with unfinished stories, many of them unfinished. And only a writer of his caliber could get away with it
Yeah.
and still be asked to start a new serialization. I couldn't afford to do it. And secondly, you will be faced with a constant pressure to meet the deadline. Soseki is said to have developed this fatal stomach ulcer because of it. He was writing in a daily newspaper year after year, which is horrible.
Yeah.
So I usually make sure to have at least a vague notion of how my novel would end, and also have a few hundred pages written before the serialization starts. I think the tradition of serialization will continue for some time in the future, but I think it ceased long ago to have the impact it once did. It's well known how eagerly the English and the American readers waited for Charles Dickens' next installment, and it was the same with the Japanese readers a long time ago. But now that we have so many other forms of art and entertainment, no one is holding her breath for the next installment to appear. The whole excitement that came with the tradition is long gone, I think.
And is that also affected by the shift to digital media? Is because in the past, of course, those serializations appeared in print. Do they still just appear in print, or do they also appear online as serialized?
Oh, I'm so internet unsavvy that I don't even know if they appear online. But I think it's in Japan, the print tradition is still quite strong.
Yes.
And like when I publish things, when my books come out in English, I'm so surprised that so many reviews come out in online magazines. Um, but in Japan, basically, you still basically have lots of paper, reviews that's printed on paper and nothing else.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And yeah, so I think the situation is a little bit different. But now that people are shifting more and more toward the internet, I just started serializing my current novel 3 months ago maybe, and my editor decided that so that people would at least be interested or would at least know the existence of my serialization, he started to put it online. So he's going to run the first three serializations online so that people might be interested in buying this literary magazine.
Excellent. I'd like to talk now about your second novel, the second novel that you wrote in Japanese, but that has just been published in translation. An I novel, it is called in English. But please later say for us the Japanese name. As from what I've read, I'm currently reading it now, actually, the novel.
Thank you.
Yes.
How nice of you.
I'm still getting through it. It's wonderful to read. It's a semi-autobiographical novel that was originally published in 1995. And I would say it's a self-reflexive contemporary novel that is a contemporary take on the Japanese literary genre. Please correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but shishosetsu?
Shishosetsu.
Shishosetsu, a kind of confessional novel, yes?
Right. Some people call it watakushi shosetsu, watakushi meaning I.
I see, I. Okay, yes. And that's a form that first emerged around the Meiji era, if I'm not mistaken. And
Taisho era.
Taiko era, yes.
Taisho era, yeah.
Taisho era. So I'm interested in that form also, this particular form of confessional novel, and why you chose to tell this story in this particular form. Was there something, what is it about that genre that allowed you or became the perfect vessel for this story?
Well, I'm sort of embarrassed to say this, to confess it, like an I novel, but there wasn't much of a deep thought behind my decision to call my second novel an I novel. After my first book came out, that is, after finishing the unfinished Soseki, I wanted to introduce myself to Japanese readers. I wanted to share with them what my upbringing was like, because it was rather unusual, especially back then. I also wanted to share with them how I had always wanted to become a writer. So I thought of writing an autobiography, or fictionalized autobiography to be precise. And since I had always been looking at Japanese literature from outside, I had always known that controversy over a confessional genre called the I novel had played an important role in the past. Some people valued it as a uniquely Japanese genre, and others vilified it as immature compared to what they thought was the most, authentic form of novel, which is based on the European novel. So I just thought it might be fun to use the generic name as the title for my semi-autobiographical work, because I was, unlike other Japanese writers, I was so conscious of the whole entire history of Japanese literature. So that's why I chose, without thinking too much, I thought it'd be just fun to use it.
Yes.
And the title also worked as a reminder for the Japanese readers that there had historically been this literary controversy over the notion of I novel. And I believe the controversy is still valid. Most of the I novels may be boring, but the best ones are the best literature we have produced in Japanese.
And an I novel has been described by the book's translator, Juliet Winters Carpenter, as Japan's first bilingual novel. The process of translation of the work into English, if I'm not mistaken, took about over a decade. And she worked in very close collaboration with you to translate that work. What were some of could you describe the bilingual nature of the work, and also what were the specific challenges of translating that work into English?
Well, let me start by saying that 4 of my books have been translated into English by Ms. Carpenter in close collaboration with me. And that process took nearly 10 years. An I novel, the one that you're kindly reading right now, and which came out this spring, was the last book we did. And it took a bit over 2 years, I think. Not necessarily longer than my other books. But the challenges we faced this time were of a particular kind. Unlike a typical Japanese fiction, which is printed vertically, I novel is printed horizontally, because it's about my bilingual experience of growing up in the States. And I wanted to include some English words and sentences in the novel. Replicating the horizontal format in the English translation didn't pose any problem, of course, but replicating the effect of seeing English in a Japanese text did. The book was promoted as a bilingual novel for commercial reasons, I suppose, but it would be an overstatement to call it a bilingual novel. English actually takes up only a small fraction of the novel. Most Japanese do not read English fluently the way many people do in the rest of the world, like
Mm.
the way you do. So I had to keep it to a minimum. But still, the visual effect of seeing two different writing systems juxtaposed, one Japanese and the other Latin alphabet, was an integral part of the novel, and that effect was impossible to replicate in the English translation. If the novel were translated into a language that uses the Latin alphabet, such as the current Malay language, you would lose that specific visual effect, but we'll still be able to juxtapose two different languages. But sorry,
No
with the
problem.
English translation, English, everything had to be in English. So Miss Carpenter and I resorted to using different typeface for those words and sentences that were in
Mhm.
English in the
Yes.
original Japanese novel. I think
Mhm.
our method worked, but only to a certain extent. But I think it worked.
I think it works too.
Okay,
It's a
thank you.
different typeface and it's also
Yeah,
bold in
bold.
English.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really
Yes.
bold.
Um, the I novel is semi, or as you say, a fictionalized autobiography. And in that sense, it mirrors your own grappling with language, including your decision to return eventually to Japan and start writing in Japanese. Could you tell
Mhm.
us a bit more about that process and that decision?
Okay. In fact, I had made that decision a long, long time ago. Like, I went to an art school just to escape from English.
Oh,
So,
wow.
and I think I was reading Dostoevsky or somebody,
Mm.
and I, I mean, and then I thought maybe I should become a writer, but and that thought grew and grew as the years went by. So, and by the time I went to graduate school, I was already determined to go back to Japan, but it just took years to execute. So I had to, I was just a sort of eternal graduate student because I was hesitant to go back. And then after I finally came back to Japan and began writing Japanese, there had indeed been moments when I did wonder whether my 20 years in the United States had been all wrong, that I had just wasted those years when I could have done everything I could to absorb the English language. And this, especially if I was to become a writer. Who would want to be a writer in a minor language when you could become a writer in English and have your work be instantly accessible to people all over the world,
Mm.
including you, the Malaysian readers, many of whom are fluent readers of English. But those moments of regret became less frequent, and now I'm fully content with the choice I've made. What's more, not only do I feel it my vocation to write in the Japanese language, but my mission to expand its linguistic and literary traditions and possibilities. I'm afraid I'm sounding a bit megalomaniacal, but I know that my time is running out. I will only have a few more productive years, 10 at the most. So my sense of urgency has become more intense than before, I think.
Mm. Excuse me. There was one passage that I really loved towards the beginning of the book, and I'm wondering if you actually experienced something like this yourself when you talk about um, the character is looking out of the window and seeing the
Mm,
snow and thinking about
yes.
the Yamamba.
Yeah.
These mythological
Yes.
beings, this kind of old crone women
Mm,
who are calling her back
mm.
to the not just Japan but the ancient um, realm and language and earth and culture of Japan. I think there's this kind of to maybe retrace her ancestry and that connection to that primordial presence. Did you feel something like that yourself?
Well, I think that was like a sort of all the feelings that I had, like sort of, like crushed into one moment, and it's not really there. I can't say that there was a specific moment like that, but I remember whenever I saw snow falling in New York or in Connecticut in that fictional world, I saw the difference between Japanese snow and the American snow. American snow is so much more drier, and I remember that tactile sense of how Japanese snow felt, and it was a constant reminder of how we grew up in different environment, and how everything was different, even something like snow, and that and I lived with my grandmother, who was a very ancient woman. And whenever I thought of Japanese writing, somehow uh, the whole notion of wanting to go back to Japan was related to all these childhood memories, which included my grandmother's presence. And all those were sort of, uh, concretized in that moment that I describe in the book.
Yes, I love that passage very much.
Okay, thank you.
As you were talking about earlier, the kind of struggle of not just your own struggle, but Japanese and also languages that are perhaps not seen as of a universal language.
Right.
Yeah. So your essay, your seminal work, actually of nonfiction, "The Fall of Language in the Age of English." I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. That was also through your own grappling with language. Was that something that you really felt strongly about? That also your decision to write in Japanese. Did you feel, and you in particular, because you were in the United States and you had this, you were actually straddling these two worlds as a writer as well. Did you really feel that there's this kind of dominance of English as a global language, that it is eroding or could possibly erode some of the local languages? Although Japanese is a major world language as well, but even in Japanese, that you felt that there's a kind of danger that is present with the predominance of English, and that languages like Japanese, and definitely even so-called minor languages, will really have to struggle to keep their language and literary traditions alive. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yes, well, I think we often talk about the downfall of not only of languages but literature in general, and so it's hard to tell if what we perceive as people reading less and less and literature being less and less important can be reduced to the influence of English, and I don't think that's the case. We live in a more mass-oriented society. We we're after uh, everything that's new. The news cycle is very quick, etc., etc. So there are many factors that contribute to what one often perceives as the degeneration of language. But since I'm a writer, I'm not a social scientist. I wanted to pick up that particular aspect of current world that might contribute to degeneration of literature, and I think I was pretty much conscious of it much more than the other Japanese writers. Um, um, and that's why I started writing The Fall of Language in the Age of English. I started writing it as a sort of short essay for a collection of my essays, but that book just grew and grew, and it took me 7 years to write and 2 more years to help translate it. So and because I started late as a writer, and as it was taking me forever to write the book, I used to curse myself for wasting so much time on a nonfiction work when I should have been working on fiction. But I'm now glad I wrote the book. I was able to figure out in my own way why the Japanese language was able to survive and thrive in the way it has. I also learned so much about the current state of other languages, and also about the inevitability of the rise of English. It's true that the growing dominance of English threatens to erode local languages and literatures. I think like we have more of expressions in katakana, which is like katakana is a special script that we use three kinds of script. We use hiragana, katakana, and Chinese characters. And with katakana is a phonetic representation, often of foreign borrowed words. So we have more and more of these words entering into Japanese language, and often unnecessarily. We use the word American English word kitchen to use to describe kitchen, but we had a perfectly a perfect word to describe kitchen or to name a kitchen as it is, and we have so much katakana writing that now I fear that many people of the past generation have trouble reading contemporary literature, and I think that sort of thing is happening in other European languages as well. They have lots of French are suffering from these anglicized expressions. But what I learned from writing the book is that we humans have always had need for a dominant language, what I call a universal language in my book. And I'm going to sound a bit academic, but universal language is a written language that's read and written even by those people who do not speak the language. Historically, we had various universal languages in different parts of the world: Sanskrit, Latin, Chinese, Arabic, among others. And those languages were not only useful as a transactional language, that is, a language used in trade or negotiations. They also allowed people who lived in a particular part of the world, but who spoke different languages, to pursue knowledge together through a common language, which is an most efficient way of pursuing truth. Just as it's most efficient for us to use the same mathematical language to pursue mathematical truth. Not that I've acquired those skills, but the vast accumulation of knowledge we humans enjoy today would not have been possible without those languages. And now, because of the advances in technology, we live in a single, interconnected, globalized world, and a single universal language that connects us all and that allows us to accumulate knowledge efficiently was bound to appear. And that language, by forces of history, such as the expansion of the British Empire and the rise of the US, turned out to be English. If you ask me if the situation, I think the situation got even, English has gotten even more dominant after I wrote the book, which I think is inevitable. And at the same time, however, people around the world seem to have grown more conscious of what this dominance would mean or might mean to their languages and literatures. And the choice we Japanese have is a relatively uncomplicated one, because we already have a strong national language, unless we want our country to turn into an English-speaking one, which some crazy people actually do. But unless we want that to happen, all we need to do is to prevent our language from deteriorating into a second-class language, to keep it fully functioning, to keep using it as the language of instruction in universities, for example, and to keep reading its best works of literature. The choice people in the former British colonies need to make, for example, is much more complicated one, I think, as you well know. As a principle, I believe that the more languages there are, the richer the world. I would welcome Malaysian literature written in the Malay language to thrive, but then I completely understand those of you who would prefer to write in English. After all, English is the universal language. And that kind of diverse choice your country enjoys is a luxury we Japanese do not have. I think life is full of irony. The full of language in the age of English bemoans the growing dominance of English. But it's because the book was translated into English, and it's because Pauline and I, both speak English, that we can talk like this about the thread of English.
This is true.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
This is
I
true.
find the situation rather ironic, but not in a negative way. I fully embrace the irony.
Absolutely, it is. I also like this paradox, because if we didn't have this common language, English, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation.
Right.
Perhaps to an interpreter, but that's one level. It's another level of separation.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
Yes, but at the same time, I fully because I'm a literary translator as well, and also from Malay into English, among other things, also from German into Malay.
Yeah, it seems
But
that you're a fluent speaker of German too.
definitely a fluent reader of German. I don't know about speaker, but definitely a fluent reader. But also, I really do embrace this the thriving of local languages. But I love the fact that we also have the ability now to translate them into other languages. So yes, perhaps as a last question, if you may indulge me, if I could ask what you are working on now.
Oh, I'm glad you asked. The title of I haven't written in Japanese for quite a long time because I was, working with Juliet Winters Carpenter to translate my own works into English. But now I just began a novel, and it's called An Ambassador and His Wife. And it's the supposition is that it's being written by an American man, who lives in Japan, but who's writing in Japanese.
Oh.
And it's so fun because then I can bring in all sorts of really Japanese things, like Japanese waka poetry from the 7th century, 10th century, and then I can make him identify himself with someone from 15th century, because he's always thinking, what Japan must have been like when Japan that's lost forever, but his brain is like a library of Japanese languages, Japanese poetries, Japanese literature, Japanese paintings, etc. So I can bring all that into this writing, which I wouldn't have been able to if he were just another Japanese person writing in Japanese. So I really enjoy the process.
I can't wait till it's translated into English. I can read that in English.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Minae. I think, yes, thank you so much. I love the conversation. I could actually keep going on, but I think we'll stop now for the restrictions of time.
Yeah, it was wonderful talking with you.
Thank you so much,
I really enjoyed it.
Okay. I would really love to have you physically in Malaysia to come to the Georgetown Literary Festival. Perhaps one day that will be possible.
Okay.
Once the travel becomes possible again. We would love to invite you to Penang.
Thank you very much.